the people who know me, I'm in the forest restoration reclamation area of research, not only because of the trees, although I like talking about aspen, as many of you guys know, but trees are one part of the forest. The forest is composed of lots of different things, and the connections between these things are the important driver for restoration and reclamation. In the boreal forest, we have overall very low tree diversity, so my work would get boring quite quickly if I would work only with trees, because most of our trees are about 5 or 6 species, especially in the eastern boreal. However, the main diversity of the forest is actually in the understories, in the herbs and in the shrubs. So that is some of the areas where we probably still have to learn a lot. So many of you guys try to reclaim these areas, and you plant stuff, and mostly you plant trees, but last week at the COSIA meeting we heard there's a seed co-op. We're trying to grow all kinds of different species now in order to increase the diversity of these forests. And really, while we know some, or sometimes more or less, about some of the tree species, we know very, very little about our shrubs and understory species, how to grow them, how to plant them out, and be successful at it and not wasting our money, because you can buy a lot of stuff and you plunk it out in the field, and when you come back a year later, they're not there anymore, so you kind of wasted your money and your time. So this is very general. Aspen is my model species, so we will talk a lot about aspen, but it's more about the concept of what seedling quality is. Okay, and I give you an idea of, through aspen, what characteristics we might want to have to look at in order to figure out whether we have good seedlings or not. Here on the left side, when I started out with my aspen research about, it's got to be now probably almost 20 years ago, I went to a nursery and got seedlings, and I planted them in a greenhouse, and that's what they look like. Even in a greenhouse, under the best conditions you can think of, babied, watered, and so on. Say, okay, there's something not right. That's not what an aspen should look like. This is outplanted aspen, and this is where I saw natural aspen seedlings, which grew from seed on their own, and they popped up, and they looked a lot different than the stuff we planted. So the question was, what's the problem? Okay, so what we looked at, what were some of the characteristics we wanted to look at? It's like root development, leaf area development. Do these trees die back when we plant them? So what are some of those characteristics which made this seedling here look so bad and this one looks so good? So if you have these poor performances, well, what it boils down to is it's increased cost. Either your seedlings die and you have to replant, or you fail your certification because you have no trees on it. So it's one way or the other, it's going to be more costly. So we have to look at seedling quality. We have to look, what do we get from the nurseries? And as managers, we have to, when we buy the seedlings, we have to go and say, I do not like this seedling. It doesn't have these characteristics which I want, and therefore take the seedling back, grow me new ones. Most of you guys don't do that because you're in a pinch. You need the seedlings now. You want to plant them, so you plant whatever you're going to get. So it's going to be a back and forth, probably in time, where people have to figure out what is actually what we want. So what drives survival and growth after outplanting? Some of these characteristics is, some of them we can manipulate, others are dependent on what we grow. So species is very important. I do not grow a blueberry like I do an aspen, or I don't grow a spruce like an aspen. Okay, so those kind of things, they drive how we grow things. Stock type. Stock type means, what do we want to plant? What does the seedling look like? How much for root system do you have? How did you store it? How did you grow it? Then also we need to figure out, where do we plant them? What types of plants? On a south-facing slope, north-facing slope, what kind of climatic conditions, and so on. And then also, what is our purpose in management, the overall objective of that? If it's just to grow trees or grow a forest and you don't worry about productivity, well, then it doesn't matter what kind of growth rates you have, for example. You still have trees, but they might grow slower, so it might not be so important. But what is a quality seedling? Well, a quality seedling will successfully establish and grow upon outplanting. That is what you want. You want a seedling you plant out for whatever purpose, and it will grow, okay, and will not die and disappear. So how do you evaluate seedling quality? So how do we go about that to look at some of those things? And there's certain characteristics. Well, a plant has a, as planters you say, green end goes up, brown end goes down. So you got to look at the green end and the brown end and look at these things. What are these characteristics? The roots are necessary for water uptake, for nutrient uptake, and of course the leaf area and so on is important for carbon fixing and for growth down the road. So traditionally, and as some of you guys know, we measure, when you get stuff from the nursery, we say, okay, we want to have a seedling which is 25 centimeters tall on average. So height and root collar diameter, some of the things we always measure. They're easy to measure and to look at. A little bit more complicated is the number of buds, how big the buds are, how much root mass you have, and what root-shoot ratios is. They already require more information and more work in order to get that information. And then you have physiological characteristics, which are even more complicated. You could look at root growth potential, dormancy status and stress resistance, and nutrient and tissue carbohydrate reserves. Carbohydrates and of nutrients in the tissues. So how important is this? For example, this is the root growth potential. That means how many roots can the plant grow when you put it in a pot. You can, in how many roots does it grow in time in a pot. And this shows you how many of the seedlings with a certain root growth potential, how many of the seedlings die. And root growth potential, the mortality decreases with the better the root system responds to outplanting. It's not rocket science, but it's an important relationship to keep in mind is what do we look at if we want to see a good seedling. Another stock type characteristic for aspen, for example, what we found was the root reserves. How many reserves? How much carbon, meaning sugar and starch, do those roots have in the reserves? And it will influence how well the seedling grows when you outplant it on a research site. So, for example, root growth potential versus root carbohydrates, you could use those as characteristics for whether these are good seedlings. Here that's pine from a different study from Tuttle et al. Shows you have to be careful. This is survival and this is shoot to root ratio, so not root to shoot. So if it increases, it actually is worse. So survival decreases when you have more shoot over less roots. So roots seem to be really important for seedlings, as one can as one can see. However, we also need to know our species. We cannot just say, oh, okay, let's measure a whole bunch of roots and shoot characteristics. We also know how they work. How do they live over a season? Especially in the boreal and temperate zones where we have clear defined seasons. We have a growing season and we have a dormant season. We need to know what happens, when do seedlings grow and when they do go into dormancy, and what are the characteristics, what are the climatic conditions and other conditions we need to move these seedlings to these conditions. Okay? So some of the characteristics of some of those things we need to understand is, for example, what are the requirements for germination and early growth? How do the seedlings grow in a natural environment? So how do they grow actually outside versus in a greenhouse? Greenhouse is so artificial, okay? This is not what we would see outside. Phenology, when does it break bud? When does it flower? When does it flush? When does it set bud? And what kind of growth strategies do they have? If they have continuous growth, they keep on growing. We can grow a 3 meter, 4 meter tall aspen in 1 year if you want, if you give them all the water and nutrients it needs. And where does it allocate its reserves to? So why can't we grow them all like conifers? We know already how to grow conifers quite well. When you could buy conifers from nurseries, they're actually fairly good. This is good quality seedlings for most parts. Okay? So why doesn't it work for all the species? Well, there are a whole bunch of trade-offs in plants, and plants grow differently. here down there is a graph, for example. This is where plants store their reserves. This is pine, this is jack pine, and the light color is tough to see. These are the needles. So what you can see when you have a pine seedling, more than 50% or about 50% of the reserves are actually stored in the needles. They're not in the roots. In aspen, this is the dark one, about 80% of the reserves are stored in the roots. So if you grow an aspen seedling with small root system, well, it has only small reserves because there's no room to put the reserves if you have small roots. So it's going to be really important to understand what the differences are between species and how they function differently. Okay? So this is some of the lessons we learned from looking at these species. So another factor I already mentioned is we need to know where we plant them and what kind of places we plant them. So site limitations. Site limitations will tell us what we should plant, not only what species, but what characteristics might be good. If you have a dry site, you want to plant likely seedlings which have a relatively healthy root system and can grow out the root system quite quickly to capture lots of resources. So we have to figure out what are our limiting factors on our sites. If we don't know what's limiting, we can plant all kinds of stuff and hope and pray that they grow, but if we do not know what's limiting, it might work sometimes, but it might not work more than once. So, can we design seedling stock? Can we create seedling stock which fits the ecology of the plant and fits also the site limitations we have? Okay? So in this case, I played around as part of my chair with aspen, and we tried to manipulate root-shoot ratios and nutrient limitations and competition. Root-shoot ratios and reserve nutrient and carbon reserves in the tissues in order to be able to deal with site conditions like drought, nutrient limitations, and competition. Learning from nature, we have to see how plants grow outside in real life. Nurseries, greenhouses are not real life. Real life is rough. It's not, greenhouse isn't rough. That's like sitting on the beach and drinking a mojito. Okay, these are little aspen seedlings. They're 1 year old. They're only about 2 to 4 inches tall. And what we found is they didn't grow much and said, oh my God, we can't grow any aspen because if they all look like this, nobody wants to buy them. But what we found is they grew a lot in the roots. They had root-shoot ratios of 8. And this is the same seedlings a year later. They grew 80 centimeters in height and had 2 meter long roots. So this guy became that guy in 1 year. So it is really important to understand these kind of characteristics. So knowing some of those things that we can manipulate to shoots, we were able to grow all kinds of different ranges of sizes of seedlings, which allowed us to change root-shoot ratios and carbohydrate reserves. So carbon reserves. So what we found is that we can stop the seedlings from height growth. And that's what we had to do. Aspen is a species which, when you fertilize and water, it keeps on growing as long as conditions are good. So we had to make it stop grow. These little guys, remember, they had root-shoot ratios of 8. They stopped growing because they didn't want to grow in height. Maybe the outside climate wasn't good enough for it. So we can do that with all kinds of different methods like drought, shortening day lengths, or cold soils, and chemically. It turned out for us that chemically works best on a nursery setting because it creates more uniform seedlings. Okay? Under these conditions, we could potentially grow salix, and populus may work the same way because they have similar growth patterns, but it hasn't been tested. So this is what I got from the nurseries when I started out this work. It was root-shoot ratios of about 1 and the carbon reserves of about 10%. And this is the range of things we could grow with under different conditions when we manipulate the seedling. So you will see this is, although a shorter seedling, this is a seedling I would prefer over a seedling like this, which is kind of like your lettuce you buy at the grocery store, and it kind of folds on you by the time you put it out into real life. The other thing we found out is that we can, when we manipulated height growth, we can also manipulate the nutrient reserves in the seedlings. And this graph here on on the left side, or sorry, on the right side, shows you a little bit about how you can fertilize seedlings. So there's increasing the growth, and there's increasing concentration of nutrients in the tissue, and you get increased growth rates until you reach a plateau where there's a sufficient range of fertilizer, and then once you get too much fertilizer, there's a short period where it actually accumulates fertilizer, and then if it gets way too high, it becomes actually toxic to the plant, and it actually it's bad. It's a lethal range. So we were able to increase the nutrient conditions in the seedlings. So this is a seedling which we call the standard feed and a high feed. As you can see, is like we were able to, by about 30% to 40%, we were able to increase the nutrient reserves in the tissues. And what you will see is here the height is not different. The seedlings were the same. So we were pounding more fertilizer into the seedlings, but they did not respond by growing taller, which they normally would do. So what does that mean? So now we have all these fancy seedlings. We try to grow them into all kinds of different conditions. Well, the real test is we plant them outside, right? So what you have here on the left side, I just want to point out to the gray bars. Don't worry about the planting time. What I want to show here is the gray bars, which are on this side, the differences between the high root to shoot ratio, meaning also carbohydrate reserves and so on, of these seedlings. When you have high root to shoot ratio and low root to shoot ratio, the gray one is the high one. This is planted on the good side. It was alfalfa field, lots of nutrients in the ground. On that side, it really didn't matter whether you had a good seedling or not, or a better seedling or not. It became way more important. Look at the growth rates too here. The growth rates about 50 centimeters, really good site. They grew very well in that year. This is a reclamation site, very poor soils. 15 centimeter was the max growth. But our high root to shoot ratio seedlings outperformed the normal seedlings. Okay? So on these sites, it becomes important to have a good quality seedling. Not on the good sites, unless you have a lot of competition and you can't manage the competition. The other graph here I want to show is, this is the nutrient-loaded stuff. These are seedlings which have the normal standard feed, and these are nutrient-loaded. On average, there were always about 30 to 40 to 50% greater performance in the field. Just on the tidbit, of nutrient-loaded seedling was the equivalent of a one-shot fertilization in the field. So you can actually quit broadcast fertilizing, at least initially, with a nutrient-loaded seedling. It's the equivalent of one fertilization in the field. The last graph I want to show seedling height. That's from a different study here. Is that seedling height is actually important once you have seedling height and survival decreases when you have taller seedlings. Okay, that was in loblolly pine. Where do we go next? Seedlings for a purpose. We still develop more ideas of how we can grow seedlings, particularly seedlings on competitive sites. Grass is a huge problem. Many of you guys know. And can we create characteristics in these seedlings that they can actually compete with the grasses on these sites? And can they grow away from those plants and creating a root system which actually competes with the grasses? As I said, there's many more species out there than the tree species. We have to probably do similar type of research for many of the species we want to commercially grow for our restoration and reclamation purposes. We cannot just rely on, let's put a bunch of seeds in the ground, let the nursery grow some stuff, and we plant it out and then hope for the best kind of thing, because I think there's a better way of saving and investing our money in order to actually have something to show for it at the end of the day. So we need to create also seedling quality indicators for a range of other species, especially the shrub and herbaceous species. Okay, that's where we go next. For example, this is where we do the competition stuff. We manipulated seedling size and tried to keep the idea of high root to shoot ratios and high reserves there So we were able to grow seedlings. We were able to produce, this is our height growth, and we grew seedlings at the, under different conditions. We were able to grow seedlings which were 120 centimeters tall, so they're about this tall, and they had still root-shoot ratios of almost 2, 1.5 to 2. Okay, so those seedlings were in somewhat larger containers, but they still had high root-to-shoot ratios without us cutting the tops off of any trees. So we're trying to put a plant into a site, in a higher competitive site, with relatively lots of roots, but where the shoot goes above the competition, so we don't get the light competition. So this is stuff has just been outplanted, and it's the first growing season is over, and I have a grad student working on that who will be digging up these seedlings. We're going to find out where the roots are, how they compete with the grasses. We planted them straight in meadows, like it was like cow pasture, right there, without cows, so they would create another problem for us. So these are kind of the idea of what the seedling sizes were differences. So we can grow all kinds of different things with different characteristics, and allows us to play around with some of those. This is the quiz at the end. You guys have to remember all these boxes. No, this is only showing how complicated it is to grow trees. That's all what I want to show with this. Don't remember any of it. Okay? It's not a straightforward thing. It is not something to just put seeds in the ground and watch them grow. And I want to thank all the sponsors for the work. There's lots of them here, and I really appreciate your support. And it has been a lot of fun, and I hope it continues going that way. And of course, all this research was done with colleagues and lots of grad students and helpers and postdocs over the years, which is a lot of fun and keeps me in the loop of why I'm doing what I'm doing. Thanks.